How do you do? We are about to unfold the story of Frankenstein. I think it will thrill you. It may shock you. It might even horrify you.
I'm CB Smith, and today I'm going to be talking about Frankenstein, both the movie and the book that's based on. And if you're worried about any spoilers or anything like that,
Well, we've warned you.
in 1815, the largest volcanic eruption in human history occurred on the island of Sumbawa in Indonesia. Mount Tambora instantly killed over 10,000 inhabitants of the island, and over 12 cubic miles of dust, dirt, and debris was shot up into the atmosphere. Climatologists theorized that Mount Tambora's eruption was a major cause for the decrease in temperatures across the world. 1816 was the coldest year on record, nicknamed the year without a summer. There were massive droughts and food shortages across the world, and it made for an inconvenient summer on June 1816 in Geneva, Switzerland. Lord Byron, bored during a cold and stormy night with some friends, decided to wager each person should write a ghost story. One of these friends was Mary Shelley, and her story that we all know today was Frankenstein. Except that's not exactly true. Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, was rewritten and edited until finally published 2 years later in 1818, anonymously, with Mary's husband Percy Shelley writing an introduction. It was published anonymously because, and it was unfortunately pretty common, egads, a woman writing a story deemed unladylike? Surely you jest. This is how we have Frankenstein. Except that's not exactly true either. Nearly all versions of this book published today is actually a reprint of an 1831 revised edition that Mary made for a series of reprint editions of novels resold for cheaper prices as before, like a 19th century mass market paperback. There are some changes, and we'll talk about them soon, but it's this 1831 edition that is finally turned into that famous movie version that everyone knows. Except that's not exactly true. The 1931 movie that has burned itself into people's memories, even if they never saw it, is actually an adaptation of a 1927 stage play adaptation of Frankenstein by Peggy Webling. So what we have here is an adaptation of generations of adaptations of a novel.
Everybody got that?
The first stage play adaptation of Frankenstein the novel was made way back in 1823 with Richard Peake. 4 more plays would be made that year. Copyright laws were looser then, and since the story was published anonymously at that point, Mary didn't see any revenue from these plays, but already aspects of the book were chipped away, new characters were added, and parts trimmed down for a new medium. The beginning of the novel starts with explorer Robert Walton writing to his sister in a series of letters as he travels up to the North Pole. There he comes across a man on the ice. This turns out to be Victor Frankenstein, half dead on a drifting iceberg. Most of the story now is told from Victor's point of view, though I do wonder at which point Walton's sister got confused why she received a novel-sized letter from a complete stranger instead of updates from her brother. The movie gets rid of Walton and the North Pole narrative and opens in a graveyard where Henry Frankenstein is waiting for a funeral to end so he can steal the corpse. I don't know why, but during these stage plays, names were changed, where Victor's name in the book is now Henry Frankenstein, while his friend from the book Henry Clerval is now Victor Clerval in the movie. Because grave robbing had become a hallmark of Frankenstein's story, and while in the book he does take human remains to make his monster, he never actually digs up a single body, because he never needed to when it's people's jobs to do that back in the 1800s. It's 2020 and we're about to get a little morbid. So in the book, Frankenstein got his body parts from 3 places. Dissecting rooms in a university and animal slaughterhouses is where he got his organs and his flesh for his creation. Yeah, I think people tend to forget sometimes that the monster is not a corpse brought to life. It's actually a whole new creature made from corpses. The bones that Frankenstein got, it's mentioned in the book, from charnel houses. A charnel house was a large building that housed the skeletons of long dead people, whom were buried in a cemetery originally. but were dug up to make room for more bodies. This was a very common practice across the world as mortality rates were very high. Yeah, it turned out like a lot of people died like from diseases and stuff. A lot. Like a lot. Please wear a mask. The beginning of this movie of gathering corpses in the night is adapted from the plays based on the book more than the book itself. This includes creating characters like not Igor, the famous hunchback henchman of the Frankenstein movies. No, he's not in this one. This hunchback henchman is Fritz.
Fritz! Hello.
Whom was added to the Frankenstein story way back to that 1823 stage production. Frankenstein is alone for the vast majority of the novel, where we, the reader, are going through his thoughts and feelings about what's happening to him and what he's doing. Compelling writing, but boring to watch a whole movie or a play for, so quickly new characters were added for Frankenstein to bounce off scenes with, like Fritz.
Hello.
More side characters that are in the novel are now added in more scenes, like where Frankenstein makes his monster. Now, there's Clerval and Frankenstein's fiancée Elizabeth watching the monster come to life. Elizabeth is Frankenstein's fiancée in the novel, but also his first cousin. She went to go live with Frankenstein after the death of her parents when she was young, and I would make a comment, but this was a pretty common practice for first cousins to marry in the 17th century. Not to mention, this is the original 1818 edition of the book. In the 1831 revised edition, Mary wrote that Elizabeth was not actually related, and... Wait a minute. Okay, so Frankenstein's mom bought an orphaned Elizabeth as a present for him. Like, they used the word present in the novel, and they still refer to each other as cousins in the 1831 edition. You know what, that's a lot of ethical questions, but, you know, at least they're not related. Elizabeth Lavenza became the inmate of my parents' house, my more than sister, the beautiful and adored companion of all my occupations and my pleasures. The movie never mentions any of this about Elizabeth's character, but it does not mention it. I like to think it doesn't. In the plays, it was added that Elizabeth and Clerval were engaged to be married before she broke it off and go with Frankenstein. Some of that past tension was added into this movie.
I'm far too fond of you.
I wish you were.
Victor.
I'm sorry.
I keep mentioning Frankenstein by his last name because, again, his name was changed to Henry for one reason or another, and because Dr. Frankenstein is not actually a doctor. In the book, he went to school and became close with one of his teachers, Dr. Waldman, but dropped out in pursuit for his obsession with creating life. Dr. Waldman is in the movie, and he's given a much larger role. Book Waldman is an inspiration to Frankenstein, both pushing on him to read about certain sciences, but also poetry. Frankenstein was not written as a science fiction story in mind. It was a romantic novel. Not romance, but romantic. Romantic novels was a kind of response to the rapid industrializations of the world at the time. While the cities grew more densely populated and class division became more and more apparent, there were new inventions and scientific discoveries being made what felt like every day. There was a fascination with those discoveries during the time of Mary Shelley. Poet William Wordsworth at the time wrote about how writers will take the discoveries of science as inspirations for their works. The remotest discoveries of the chemist, botanist, and mineralist will be as proper object of the poet's art as any upon which it can be employed. If the time should ever come when what is now called science, thus familiarized to men, shall be ready to put on, as it were, a form of flesh and blood, the poet will lend his divine spirit to aid the transfiguration, and will welcome the new being, thus produced, as a dear and genuine inmate of the household of man. Knowing how the monster was absolutely not welcomed as a literal form of flesh and blood into the household of man, I don't think Wordsworth's words had much worth.
That was the worst pun ever.
The term science fiction may have been popularized in the early 1900s. The first printing of the word actually dates back to 1851, 33 years after Frankenstein was first published. Scottish-American poet William Wilson wrote a little earnest book upon a great old subject, a book about genre and poetry, in which the first printed use of science fiction is defined. Science fiction in which the revealed truths of science may be given interwoven with a pleasing story which may itself be poetical and true, thus circulating a knowledge of the poetry of science clothed in a garb of the poetry of life. Dr. Waldman is not in the book for very long, but he was a positive character that takes Frankenstein under his wing in his teachings. In the movie, he's given a much bigger role, but his talk of poetry incorporated into science has now been replaced with him just being the caring teacher and mentor of Frankenstein.
So we have our main characters, Frankenstein, Dr. Waldman, Clerval, Elizabeth, and of course my man Fritz.
Hello.
Now it's about time for the monster. It's about time.
It's alive.
It's about time.
Oh, it's alive.
It's about it. It just kind of appears in the book.
One aspect of the romantic novel is the dramatic displays of emotion. There are pages and pages of Frankenstein lamenting his obsession, disregarding concerns of his family and friends to continue his work. So, for all its legacy on science and actions of men in pursuit of knowledge, Frankenstein is a character and emotionally driven novel. There is only fleeting mentions of chemistry. In the original 1818 edition, there's no mention of electricity or lightning, but galvanism, the practice of chemically induced electricity through a voltaic pile of copper and zinc metals, was added into the 1831 edition of the novel. There is no big
It's alive.
segment of the book. These were added into the stage plays later on to add spectacles for the audience, and it is iconic being a stable with the monster almost 100 years later. And about that monster, this is how many see the monster to this day from this movie. The book does have some description on how he looks. His yellow skin was scarcely covered the works of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. The high forehead, bolts in the neck, and the green skin have all become the standard idea of how the monster looks. There are little details that I like how the sleeves are too short, and the large boots make Boris Karloff look much bigger, and how Karloff took out his dentures to give one side of his face a sunken look. It all makes a still great effect.
Yeah, it's not accurate to the book, but it sure looks good.
In the movie, everyone is there when the monster rises, with Dr. Waldman being the only one that makes any protest to his existence, while in the book, Frankenstein is alone when he sees the monster. It actually scares and disgusts him so much, he runs away, back to his family's home, abandoning his creation.
Victor Frankenstein is a coward, obsessing over making his creation, and when it didn't come out how he wanted it to, he just runs away. Throughout the rest of the book, he will have these recurring dizzying spells when confronted with his creation, and the crimes and murders that it commits to draw Frankenstein out. In the movie, all of that fear and doubt is now given to Dr. Waldman, and Frankenstein being the voice of reason. Sometimes.
He's only a few days old, remember. So far, he's been kept in complete darkness.
Several days in the dark. You're really earning that #1 dad mug there, aren't you, Frankenstein? The movie had a more sympathetic Frankenstein and carried some of his negative aspects of the book to other characters, but the movie also made the monster much more sympathetic.
The name Frankenstein is given to the monster in later adaptations, but not in the original novel.
The monster can't speak in this movie. He's able to speak in broken, stilted English in the sequels, but in the novel, the monster can speak very eloquently, actually. When he confronts Frankenstein about his being brought to life, he says, "I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel, whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed."
Yeah, the monster has major daddy issues is what I'm saying, which just leads him on a path of more and more disappointment when he confronts other people that want nothing to do with him but to get rid of him.
I want you to leave No!
Look, this is all I've got, all right? I had a tough upbringing. My daddy was not nice to me.
No one shows the monster any kind of kindness in the book, except for a blind man, and only briefly. In the movie, he ultimately escapes after killing Dr. Waldman and the very, very abusive Fritz.
Fritz! Hello.
There's a little girl in the movie that the monster accidentally drowns after they throw flower petals in the water, and they share this really cute moment as the flowers float, but the monster soon learns that Pennywise the Clown made a good point.
They all flow down.
This drowning scene is actually a combination of two parts of the book.
In the book, the monster actually rescues a girl from drowning in the river, only for him to be shot at by the girl's brother, thinking the monster was attacking her. And later on, the monster finds a 6-year-old boy, and so desperate to find anyone to like him, he threatens to kidnap the boy and force him to accept him. When the monster finds out that the boy is actually William, Victor Frankenstein's youngest brother, he gleefully strangles him to death and frames William's nanny for the murder, which she is then executed for.
This taking the monster's more homicidal scenes away happens again in the movie, where the monster appears to Elizabeth to frighten her and just kind of leaves, while in the book he strangles her while Frankenstein watches. So while Frankenstein is somewhat kinder in the movie, the monster is much more of a character you sympathize with, making his only murder an accident, while the rest can be argued was in self-defense, culminating in the famous windmill ending in which the monster tosses his creator over the balcony to kill his last tormentor while he's consumed by the flames. It really is a tragic downer of an ending to this movie, and you're left with this deep, melancholy thought on the destructive nature of man and their abusive treatment of their own making, as the mob cheers on the death of the monster. And it would have ended there if test audiences didn't like the downer ending, so a more cheerful scene is tacked on at the end. While not an accurate adaptation of the book, this 1931 movie told the story of Frankenstein, what made the book so compelling and long-lasting. It embodies and created the main aspects of what would become science fiction, contemplating what may be possible, as well as a character drama questioning and lecturing the nature of mankind in the pursuit of that progression. After all, the monster was not born a monster, he was made one. At the end of the book, the monster lays next to a dying Frankenstein on that boat out in the Arctic Ocean. He tells Walton of all the murders he committed in pursuit of revenge against his creator.
My heart was fashioned to be susceptible of love and sympathy, and when wrenched by misery to vice and hatred, it did not endure the violence of the change without torture, such as you cannot even imagine.
He was a nice guy.
The fallen angel becomes the malignant devil, and yet, even that enemy of God and man had friends and associates in this desolation. I am alone.
And when the nice guy loses his patience, the devil shivers.
Happiness and affection are turned into bitter and loathing despair. In what should I seek for sympathy?
And why should the creature apologize for the monster he became? No one ever said sorry for making him that way.
And why? Why didn't Mackenzie say yes when I asked her out to the 8th grade dance? And we'll be back in another episode to talk about the 1994 Frankenstein adaptation. I need to get out of some clothes right now.
Hi everyone, I hope you enjoyed this little dive into Frankenstein as much as I had fun making it. I obviously missed some details, and feel free to comment below if you want to talk about them. I'd love to discuss the book or the movie with you, hear your opinions, and tell you how you're wrong. I'm just kidding. But if you really like me, you'd hit that subscribe button. But in reality, I do hope to see you all in the next video, and stay safe and take care.